Your wife is pregnant.
The hospital room was too white, too quiet, too clean for the kind of pain filling it. Vanessa lay on the examination table, her body trembling from days of abdominal pain she had dismissed as stress. Dr. Seo, an independent VIP physician trusted by Seoul's wealthiest families, stared at the ultrasound screen for a long moment before turning around. Your wife is pregnant. Dr. Seo had never treated Min-Jae before and knew nothing about the fertility diagnosis from 8 years earlier. He was simply reporting what the ultrasound showed. The words hit him with devastating force. Min-Jae Lee, 35 years old, head of the Lee syndicate's criminal operations, a man who had built his reputation on never once losing control of a room, stood frozen. His jaw tightened. His hands, usually steady enough to hold a blade without a tremor, curled into fists at his sides. 8 years ago, after a syndicate conflict left him with a severe internal injury, the family's trusted physician, Dr. Park, had told him that the injury had permanently damaged his fertility and that he was unlikely to father children. Min-Jae had understood it as a permanent diagnosis. No children. Ever. He had carried that sentence in silence for 8 years, burying it so deep that even his own bodyguards didn't know the weight he carried. Now a physician who knew nothing about that diagnosis was telling him the impossible had happened. Who is the father? His voice was low, controlled, terrifying in its stillness. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Vanessa alone, sick and confused, staring at the tiny, flickering heartbeat on the screen. She had no idea she was pregnant, and no idea how it could even be possible. He never got the chance to demand the truth. A single gunshot shattered the hospital window. Glass rained down like ice. Min-Jae spun. And pure instinct, not thought, not doubt, not the betrayal clawing at his chest, sent him diving across the room to shield the woman he believed had destroyed everything he thought he knew about himself. For one frozen second, neither of them moved. Then the room exploded into chaos. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how a forced marriage built on lies ended in a gunshot through a hospital window, we have to go back 3 months to a woman who never wanted any of this. Vanessa was 23, sharp-eyed and stubborn in the particular way of someone who had learned early that no one was coming to save her. She had grown up in Lagos, moved to Seoul with her father as a teenager, and spent her adolescence translating menus, apologizing for accents that weren't hers to apologize for, and watching her father pour every coin he had into a small Nigerian restaurant that, for a while, thrived. Then it didn't. A bad year. A worse year after that. Desperate and ashamed, her father borrowed money from an illegal gambling network, a network with invisible threads running straight into the Lee syndicate. He lost. He borrowed again to cover the loss. Interest compounded like a living thing, hungry and patient. Until a modest debt had metastasized into $2 million, he had no possible way to repay. The Lee syndicate did not send men to break his legs. They were more efficient than that. They placed him under supervised confinement comfortable enough to keep him alive, restrictive enough to keep him compliant, and waited. Min-Jae ran the syndicate's operations, its security, its criminal networks, with a precision that made rivals nervous and allies grateful they weren't rivals. But power in the Lee family was split like a fault line. His mother, Madam Choi Lee, controlled the trusts, the legitimate corporations, the succession structure that decided who would ultimately inherit everything that mattered. Min-Jae ruled the streets. Madam Choi ruled the future. It was Madam Choi who summoned Vanessa. The office was cold marble and colder eyes. Madam Choi did not raise her voice. She never needed to. "Marry my son," she said, sliding a folder across the desk. "Legally, 1 year. Stay married for exactly 1 year, and I will personally guarantee this agreement forgiving your father's entire debt. Leave before the year ends, and it returns in full with interest." Vanessa's first instinct was refusal. Her second was her father's face, thin and frightened, in a room he wasn't allowed to leave. "I have to sacrifice myself to save my family," she told herself that night, and by morning she had signed. What Vanessa didn't know, what she wouldn't learn for months, was exactly why Madam Choi had chosen her. Not because she was convenient, because she was safe. A woman with no powerful family, no understanding of Korean elite politics, no way to fight back if things went wrong. Under the Lee family's succession structure, a legitimate biological heir to Min-Jae would eventually inherit controlling shares in the family's legitimate businesses, weakening Madame Choi's control over the fortune she had spent decades building. She needed Min-Jae married to a woman with no powerful family behind her, and most importantly to a woman she believed could never give him an heir. Vanessa, she believed, was the perfect solution, a wife who could never threaten her. Min-Jae rejected the marriage the moment his mother proposed it. "I don't need a wife," he said flatly. "I need this debt handled." "Then handle it by marrying the girl," Madame Choi replied. "Or handle it by killing her father, and watch what that does to every debt network that depends on people believing we keep our word." He hated that she was right. Killing the father would create noise, instability, an opening for rival factions circling the syndicate like sharks smelling blood in calm water. The marriage was clean, strategic, a business transaction with a human face attached. He accepted because the arrangement solved the debt without bloodshed, but he carried another lesson his mother had drilled into him since childhood, not with fists, but with cold, consistent proof. If you don't control everything, someone you love will be used as a weapon against you. It was why he had never let himself love anyone at all. Their wedding was small, silent, and entirely without joy. The penthouse Vanessa moved into was the size of the restaurant her father had lost 3 times over. Glass walls, marble floors, a silence so complete it felt like living inside a held breath. She and Min-Jae orbited each other like two people assigned to share a cage. Neither of them chose. The first night was almost funny, if either of them had been capable of laughing yet. Min-Jae, a man feared by rival gangs across Seoul and beyond, spent 45 minutes constructing an elaborate wall of pillows down the center of their enormous bed. A barricade so meticulous, it looked engineered by structural architects. He fluffed the final pillow, satisfied, certain no accidental contact could possibly occur. Vanessa, it turned out, was the most chaotic sleeper he had ever witnessed. By morning, the pillow wall had been utterly obliterated, and Min-Jae woke to find his arm wrapped protectively around her waist, her back pressed against his chest, his face buried against her hair. He shot upright so fast he rolled straight off the bed and hit the floor with a thud that echoed through the entire penthouse. Vanessa blinked awake to find the terrifying head of the Lee syndicate's operations sprawled on the floor in his pajamas, glaring at the ceiling as though it had personally betrayed him. "Are you—" "I'm fine," he snapped, standing and straightening his shirt with the dignity of a man pretending nothing had happened. He walked out without another word. Outside the bedroom door, his 3 bodyguards, June, the fiercely loyal right hand who had taken a blade meant for Min-Jae's ribs 3 years earlier. Daniel, the cold, quiet intelligence specialist who noticed everything and said almost nothing. And Ryan, the youngest of the 3, whose humor Min-Jae tolerated the way one tolerates a persistent younger sibling, exchanged a look. "He fell off the bed," Ryan whispered, delighted. "He fell off the bed," June confirmed. By that afternoon, a betting pool had quietly formed among the 3 men. The wager simple. How many weeks until their untouchable boss cracked and admitted he had feelings for his own wife? Not everyone found the marriage amusing. Among Min-Jae's senior lieutenants was Kang Dae-sung, a calculating veteran of the syndicate's earliest, bloodiest years. He had watched the wedding from the back of the room with his arms folded, saying nothing, though his silence carried its own opinion. He believed Min-Jae was allowing himself to be distracted by a woman who understood nothing of their world, and he quietly wondered, not for the first time, whether his boss was growing too soft to lead. Vanessa noticed none of this. She was too busy noticing something else, a man standing across the street from the penthouse entrance, motionless, wearing a distinctive silver badge she didn't recognize. He wasn't dressed like the security men Vanessa normally saw around Min-Jae. He was watching her specifically, and when their eyes met for half a second, he turned and disappeared into the crowd. She filed the memory away, uneasy, and said nothing. There was no one yet she trusted enough to tell. The cold hostility between them didn't melt all at once. It thawed the way ice does in early spring in small, easily missed moments neither of them fully registered until much later. Vanessa began quietly rebuilding pieces of the life the debt had taken from her. She filled the penthouse's sterile kitchen with jars of dried pepper, crayfish, and spices shipped in secret from a small Nigerian grocer across the city, determined that even inside a gilded cage, some part of her would still taste like home. It was there, over a simmering pot of pepper soup that everything between them changed. Min-Jae wandered into the kitchen one evening, drawn by a smell he couldn't identify, and made the catastrophic mistake of accepting a bowl Vanessa offered without hesitation. He was a man who had stared down loaded weapons without blinking. He was not prepared for authentic Nigerian pepper soup. His first spoonful hit like fire. His pride, the same pride that had once negotiated territory disputes without so much as raising his voice, refused to let him admit defeat. His face went crimson, sweat beaded at his temple. His eyes streamed helplessly, and still he forced a second spoonful down, jaw clenched, insisting through gritted teeth that it was fine. Vanessa watched him for a moment, torn between amusement and something softer, before she reached over without asking permission and gently wiped a tear from the corner of his eye with her thumb. "You don't have to prove anything to me," she said quietly. For the first time since she'd met him, Min-Jae feared, controlled, untouchable. Min-Jae looked like an ordinary man, embarrassed, human, seen. Something shifted in his chest that night, something he didn't have a name for yet, and he didn't finish the soup, but he also didn't forget it. That single bowl of pepper soup became the story's quiet heartbeat, a moment Vanessa would return to again and again, in small ways, whenever the walls between them threatened to rebuild themselves. The pillow barricade disappeared entirely by the third week, not through any single conversation, but through dozens of small surrenders. Vanessa caught him once, late at night, quietly practicing Nigerian slang on his phone, mouthing words with the same intense focus he usually reserved for reviewing security footage. He noticed her watching and immediately pretended to be reading something else entirely. She let him have the lie, smiling to herself as she walked away. When a syndicate conflict left a shallow blade wound across his shoulder one night, Vanessa didn't hesitate. She cleaned it herself in the dim bedroom light, her fingers steady despite the blood, her voice low as she scolded him for not calling a proper doctor. Min-Jae sat still beneath her hands, and something in him, some wall built over 8 years of believing love, was a weakness his mother had taught him to fear, simply gave way. They were inches apart when their eyes met, and for the first time neither of them looked away. They were seconds from their first kiss when the double doors burst open, and Madame Choi walked in unannounced, catching her terrifying son half undressed, blushing furiously, and scrambling backward like a teenager caught by a parent. "I need to discuss the quarterly board report," Madame Choi said flatly, betraying nothing, though her eyes lingered a moment too long on the scene before her. Without realizing it, Min-Jae began noticing when Vanessa wasn't in the penthouse. He would never have admitted he was waiting for her. He simply found reasons to stay awake, papers to review, calls to return, until he heard her key in the door. By the 6th week, whatever remained of the original contract had quietly dissolved. Neither of them was pretending anymore that their attraction was an accident. What replaced the contract was an obligation. When they finally came together, it was born of something neither of them had planned for, and both of them had stopped fighting. For a few weeks, the penthouse felt less like a cage and more like a home neither of them had expected to build. It didn't last. Around the 7th week of their marriage, Vanessa began feeling unwell exhaustion that sleep didn't fix, nausea that struck without warning. She assumed it was stress. Pregnancy wasn't simply unlikely to her. She had spent months believing Min-Jae could not father a child. Nothing about her symptoms had made her question that assumption. By the 3rd month, the symptoms had become impossible to ignore. Madame Choi noticed the symptoms before anyone else did, watching her daughter-in-law with the sharp, clinical attention of a woman who had spent her entire life reading rooms for threats. She sent her own private physician under the guise of a routine health assessment. The examination confirmed Madame Choi's worst fear. Vanessa was pregnant. Madame Choi understood immediately what this meant. A legitimate heir would destroy the protection she had spent 8 years building around her control of the succession. But killing Vanessa immediately would give Min-Jae reason to investigate everyone closest to him, including his mother. Madame Choi needed him to believe Vanessa's death was connected to her own betrayal, not to anything close to home. She began building a lie, patient and precise. Vanessa, meanwhile, had been quietly meeting with Samuel Okoye, a Nigerian Korean food distributor who supplied specialty ingredients to restaurants across Seoul. He was helping her source authentic Nigerian ingredients for a restaurant she dreamed of one day reopening in her father's name. The meetings were entirely innocent business, ambition, A small private hope she hadn't yet told Min-Jae about because she wanted to surprise him once it became real. At one of those meetings, Vanessa caught another glimpse of the same silver badge she had noticed outside the penthouse weeks earlier, worn by a man loitering near the restaurant entrance. She barely registered it at the time, one more stranger in a crowded street, and went back to comparing spice suppliers with Samuel. Madame Choi's people photographed several of those meetings from carefully chosen angles, creating the appearance of intimacy where none existed, a hand resting briefly on a shoulder, heads bent close over a laminated ingredient list, framed to look like something it never was. When the photographs reached Min-Jae, he said nothing. He simply grew quieter, colder, watching Vanessa across the dinner table with an expression she couldn't quite read. His bodyguards noticed immediately the two careful questions about her day, the sudden interest in reviewing security footage near the market district, the barely concealed tension in his jaw whenever Samuel's name came up. June and Ryan exchanged knowing looks. Their untouchable boss, jealous and sulking like a man half his age, was somehow both hilarious and painfully obvious to everyone except Vanessa herself. Then came week 12, and the collapse in the kitchen, and the ambulance, and Dr. Seo's ultrasound screen, and the words that shattered everything. Your wife is pregnant. In the present moment, standing in that hospital room, Min-Jae's mind moved fast and cruel. Pregnant. Impossible. Unless the diagnosis he'd carried for 8 years was wrong, or unless someone else was responsible. His thoughts snapped immediately to the photographs. To Samuel. To betrayal. He walked out believing the worst. Then the window shattered. An instinct overrode everything else. He didn't stop to resolve his suspicion before diving across the room to cover her body with his own. Whatever he believed about the child, whatever fury sat coiled in his chest, some deeper part of him had already decided her life mattered more than his anger. The gunshot changed everything. Min-Jae got Vanessa out of the exposed room while hospital security locked down the floor. Once she was safe, Daniel began reconstructing exactly how the shooter had known where to find her. Daniel moved fast, pulling security footage, cross-referencing hospital staff schedules, tracing the shooter's vantage point with the same cold precision he applied to everything. What he found chilled even him. The attacker had known Vanessa's exact room number and her precise arrival window information, restricted to an extremely small circle inside the syndicate's own command structure. This wasn't a rival gang. This was someone close, someone inside. Someone had known exactly where Vanessa would be, exactly when she would arrive, and exactly which room she would occupy. Min-Jae's response was immediate and suffocating. He doubled her security and began restricting her movements, refusing to let her leave without an escort, treating every unfamiliar face and unexplained object as a potential threat. He meant it as protection. Vanessa experienced it as a second cage, no less confining for being built out of love instead of contract. You saved me from your mother's cage, she told him one night, exhausted and furious, only to build one yourself. Protect me. Don't own me. The words landed harder than any blade had ever managed to. Min-Jae stood in silence for a long moment, forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. His desperate need to control every variable around her wasn't just protection. It was the same fear his mother had planted in him decades ago, wearing a different disguise. He gave her back her freedom, piece by piece, though it cost him every instinct screaming otherwise. It was in this raw, unguarded moment that Vanessa finally asked him the question that had been sitting unspoken between them since the wedding. Why are you risking everything for me? Because you're my wife, he said. That's the contract, she replied quietly. Min-Jae was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had none of its usual armor. No, he said. That's the excuse I've been using. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to like this video. Now, let's see what Min-Jae discovers next. The investigation that followed unraveled slowly, each thread pulling loose to reveal another hidden beneath it. Vanessa provided the clue that finally connected everything. Piecing through her memory out loud, she recalled seeing the same distinctive silver badge 3 times. Outside the penthouse in the earliest days of her marriage, near one of her meetings with Samuel, and again near the hospital shortly before the shooting. On their own, the sightings had meant nothing. Said aloud, together they formed a pattern. Daniel spent 2 days cross-referencing security footage and internal personnel records before finally identifying the badge. Park Sung-ho, a member of Madame Choi's private security detail, not the syndicate's general forces. The investigation initially pointed elsewhere, toward Kang Dae-sung, an ambitious lieutenant who had never hidden his resentment of Vanessa's growing influence over Min-Jae. He had motive. He had opportunity. He had also openly complained that Vanessa was weakening Min-Jae's judgment. For a tense stretch, it seemed the case was closed. But Daniel, thorough as always, discovered Dae-sung had been quietly assembling his own operational coup, a plan entirely unrelated to Vanessa, one that the shooting had actually damaged rather than served. His records placed him elsewhere when the shooting was arranged, and Daniel found no evidence that he knew about the pregnancy. The red herring dissolved under scrutiny, and the trail led back, inevitably, to Park Sung-ho. Sung-ho, it turned out, had not fired the bullet himself. His role had been quieter and, in its own way, more damning. He had supplied the shooter with Vanessa's exact location and arrival schedule. A hospital contact secretly supplied Vanessa's room and arrival information to Madame Choi's people, who passed it to Sung-ho. He then relayed the information to the shooter. Only the hospital's VIP coordinator, Min-Jae's security team, and a handful of senior Lee personnel had legitimate access to those details. Sung-ho wasn't part of Min-Jae's security chain. He answered directly to Madame Choi. Digging deeper into Sung-ho's history, Daniel and June uncovered something far larger than a single assassination attempt. Hidden in an archived medical database connected to the hospital where Min-Jae's original fertility testing had been processed, separate from Dr. Park's falsified written diagnosis, they found the original fertility test results from 8 years earlier raw, unaltered data showing that Min-Jae's reproductive function had not been permanently damaged. Alongside it, a trail of bank transfers from Madame Choi's personal accounts to Dr. Park, spanning nearly a decade. Confronted with the evidence, Dr. Park's composure finally broke. He confessed everything. He had stayed silent for 8 years because Madame Choi had threatened his family and paid him to maintain the lie. 8 years of grief, of quiet mourning for a future Min-Jae believed he could never have, had been manufactured by his own mother. For Min-Jae, the truth was now undeniable. The child Vanessa carried was not evidence of betrayal. It was proof that his mother had stolen 8 years of his life with a lie. Min-Jae summoned the syndicate's senior leadership, family executives, and trusted captains to his mother's compound, a room full of people who expected him to arrive furious and demanding punishment for Vanessa's supposed indiscretions. Instead, he laid the evidence on the table in front of everyone. The falsified medical records, Dr. Park's signed confession, the financial transfers, the photographs manipulated to frame Samuel, the connection to Park Sung-ho, and the hospital shooting. Piece by piece, he dismantled his mother's carefully constructed lie in front of the very people whose respect she had spent decades cultivating. Madame Choi's composure cracked for the first time in the story. "You think you're a hero because you love a woman now?" She spat, desperate, reaching for the only weapon she had left. "How many people did you hurt to build this empire? How many lives did you take without a second thought?" The room went silent. Every captain, every executive, waited to see whether the accusation would land. Min-Jae didn't flinch, and he didn't deny it. "I'm not innocent," he said. "That's exactly why it ends with me." The evidence was too extensive to suppress, and too many senior members of the family had now seen it laid out in full. Madame Choi no longer had the financial or political leverage left to force the room to protect her. Min-Jae stripped his mother of every position of power she held within the family structure, in front of the entire leadership. He ordered the family's legal counsel to initiate an emergency freeze on her legitimate corporate holdings pending investigation, then personally handed the evidence of her financial crimes and the conspiracy against Vanessa over to the authorities, understanding fully what that decision would cost him. Then Min-Jae did the one thing no one in the room expected. He began dismantling the syndicate's illegal operations from within, turning over records, cutting criminal ties, and separating the family's legitimate businesses from the criminal network. He knew it would expose crimes he had committed himself, and he was prepared to face whatever consequences followed. He had spent his life believing that keeping control of everything was the only way to protect the people he loved. Letting go of that control was, in the end, the only way he could become someone different from the man his mother had created. With the evidence formally handed over, authorities moved against Madame Choi, and within days she was arrested, her decades of quiet authority collapsing into a single afternoon. Min-Jae found Vanessa waiting in the penthouse, and for the first time since their wedding day, he had nothing left to hide from her. "The debt is gone," he told her, placing the original agreement in her hands. "The cancellation has been formally recorded. Your father is free from the Lee syndicate. The contract is gone. You don't owe me anything." Vanessa looked down at the document, the paper that had once defined the entire shape of her life, and then back up at him. She could have walked away. For the first time, nothing was stopping her. Instead, she stayed not because a debt demanded it, not because a contract required it, but because for the first time since this began, staying was entirely her own choice. Several months later, in a private hospital room, far calmer than the one where this story began, Vanessa gave birth to their daughter. Min-Jae held the crying newborn in his arms, the child he had spent 8 years believing he could never have, and wept openly for the first time anyone had ever seen. The future his mother's lie had stolen from him had finally, impossibly, arrived. A year after their daughter's birth, Vanessa's father stood in the doorway of a small but thriving Afro-Korean fusion restaurant, built through Vanessa's own savings, legitimate financing, and hard work, with no money from Min-Jae's criminal empire attached to it. He apologized quietly for the debt that had put his daughter in that position, for the years she had sacrificed to save him, and for the suffering his mistake had brought into her life. Vanessa took his hands. "You don't have to carry that anymore," she told him. That evening, after closing, the family gathers in the restaurant kitchen. A pot of pepper soup simmers on the stove exactly as it once did, in a cold, unfamiliar penthouse. Vanessa holds their daughter against her shoulder, humming softly, while Min-Jae takes a spoonful from the pot the way he has every single time since that very first disastrous bowl. His eyes water instantly. Vanessa watches him, amused, unable to hide her smile. "Still too spicy?" "Yes," he admits, wiping his eyes. "Then why do you keep eating it?" He looks at his wife, then down at the small sleeping face resting against her shoulder. "Because you made it." He entered this marriage believing love was a weakness, and that family was simply something powerful people used to control one another. Vanessa taught him otherwise, one small, stubborn act of kindness at a time. He gave up the empire that had defined him. In its place, he gained something that empire could never have given him: a wife who chose him freely, with nothing left holding her there but her own heart, a daughter he had once been told he could never have, and a life that, for the first time, truly belonged to him and no one else. He could not erase what his mother had done to him. He could not undo the years he had spent becoming the man she needed him to be. But he could choose, finally, what came next. Love did not erase his past. It gave him the courage to stop repeating it. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who loves meaningful stories. We'll see you in our next unforgettable journey.